as a church. We are into the second part of our Ghosts Upon the Earth series. It's page 91 in your journal if you're taking notes. This series this January is really about positioning ourselves as a community, as a church, as one that takes mental illness seriously as a category. We're basically saying that what we want to do is treat it with the seriousness and the authenticity that we would treat all illnesses. Sometimes what we've found is that we kind of try, even with our best intentions, to kind of subcategorize mental illness as something that, we're not really sure what to do with it. And what we're trying to work out here as a community really is the idea and the mantra, perhaps you might want to put it, where what we're saying is it's okay to not be okay. Now, this is a little heavy, and it's kind of a heavy start to the year, perhaps, at some level, and it's very difficult to teach, because often as a teacher, you're kind of wanting to get into something more encouraging and light. But if you struggle with depression, anxiety, fears, mental illnesses of some sort, or if you have friends or family or church members that are sat near you that journey with this, then you know that this is a heavy subject. It's a difficult subject. And we're wrestling with it as a community, not as psychologists necessarily, not as professionals in this field, but as a church. So what we sort of said last week, and we want to continue saying this, is that we support and affirm people that will find professional help, that will see psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors to help them with this. Our question is, what does it look like to follow Jesus in the midst of that? What does it look like to be a church that supports people in this process? We kind of know as well that in wrestling with this subject as deep and as heavy as this, it's made additionally difficult because those of us, perhaps, that don't struggle with mental challenges in this particular way, those of us that haven't encountered anxieties and depressions in the way that we're talking about them, those of us that don't relate to that like that, find it very difficult to find empathy sometimes for those that do, because it's so unimaginable to us. You see a guy with a broken leg, his leg's in a cast, and you kind of go, wow, if I had a broken leg. And you kind of start to relate, and you feel empathy, and you work it out from there. But when people talk about their depressions or their anxieties or their other various mental challenges that they might struggle with, we find it difficult to know what to make of that. And that unknownness can often present itself amongst us as humans in a kind of way that basically, in a well-meaning way, we try and fix everyone. I don't know if you've noticed this about people, but we love fixing each other. Actually, let me be clear. We like fixing other people. We don't like it when they fix us. So we're really good at giving fixing advice. And we sometimes do it with the best intentions. We do it to the people we love. But there's a sense of it kind of comes along with a little bit of a judgment of like, well, this is how you should be better. We often do this thing where we kind of line people up and make comparisons. So, you might tell someone, that you struggle with anxiety or depression. And they're like, oh, my friend John, he had depression. And what he did was he stopped eating gluten. And which, by the way, as you've noticed, is the answer to all problems in the 21st century, gluten. And which is really unfortunate for us because gluten is in everything. But people do this. They say, oh, here's this idea. I knew this guy. He stood on his head every day, and that really stopped his depression. And you're thinking, well, yeah, that's probably because he was dizzy and couldn't really focus on anything else other than the fact that his blood was all in his brain. And we kind of have this thing as humans that we want to help people and we want to fix people. But unfortunately, when we stand from that position and say, here's all the things you can do in order to fix yourself, what that actually does, it accentuates the shame that people living with this sort of challenge have to deal with. So Brennan Manning, in his beautiful memoir, All Is Grace, says this: it's the sense of being completely insufficient as a person, the nagging feeling that for some reason you're defective or unworthy. You see, when we approach people with the assumption that the best thing for you to do is for me to fix you, what it does is it makes that person feel kind of less than normal, less than good enough, less than sufficient. So, added to the huge burden of mental illnesses, you now have shame and insufficiency. This is why I think that people that struggle with anxieties, depressions, fears, and other mental illnesses, what they often find when they bump into other people that suffer similarly, they find a sense of solidarity. There's a sense of togetherness comes from meeting someone that knows something of the pain that you're encountering. Maybe you've experienced this in your own life. Or maybe you've experienced it around some of your friends. Maybe you see what happens to them when they find people that struggle similarly to them. This is part of the reason why one of the things I want to say this morning is a thank you to so many of you from throughout the community in the past week who have sent us emails to say a variety of things. People have emailed to say, thank you so much for talking about this in church. This helps just make it more acceptable to talk about with our friends. Other people have emailed and said, is there anything that I can do to help or support? Is there a way that we can come alongside one another? And then some people have sent beautiful stories about their own journey with depression, their own journey with anxiety, their own facing their own mortality and wondering about that. And I'm hugely encouraged as a pastor when you encounter emails like this, because from people saying, I'm glad we can talk about this, and this is a safe church to talk about those things, to people saying, what can we do? Is there something we can support and help with? To people feeling safe enough to talk about their own journey. This encourages me that we're pushing ourselves towards being the type of church that God has called us to be. A group of people that care and support and are involved. And I will get round to replying to everyone that's emailed me, and I think it's so important that we say thank you to that. It does bring out some sense of our own inadequacies, because when we also are aware of the fact that I'm very aware of the fact I'm not a psychologist. You're probably aware of that with your own friends that walk a journey like this, and if it's your own personal journey, you're aware of how often it seems so difficult to know what to do. But one thing that comes really solidly through so many of the messages and emails that have been sent in this past week is that not only is it difficult living with mental illness, but the pressures it creates on our relationships is also an additional challenge for us, the way it affects the people that we're with. The people that we journey life with often make assumptions about the track of life that we should follow. That we are going one way and they feel like they know how we're going to move tracks onto a better way of being, a different way of working out our lives. And as much as we appreciate what people are trying to do when they say, well, you're going like this, but we think you should go over here. Have you noticed that how often, and doctors identify that this happens amongst patients and ill people all the time, that it's so easy to talk about the problem, and it's so easy to talk about everything that's going wrong, that it's easy to forget that there's a person in the middle of it. So we assume we know what's best for the people we love. We assume that we know how to fix them. And we start to talk about them. We start to talk around them. We start to talk about them as if they are a problem. And we forget that actually maybe our assumptions about what they're looking for and what they need are not what they're looking for and what they need. Jesus models this beautifully for us in a story that's well known in Mark chapter 10. Jesus is leaving the city of Jericho, and a man called Bartimaeus, who is blind, hears that Jesus is passing by. So he shouts to Jesus that someone might attract Jesus' attention, and Bartimaeus is brought before Jesus. And there's this beautiful scene in Mark chapter 10 that goes like this. Then Jesus says to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Now, some of us read this story and go, is this like the dumbest question in the history of dumb questions? Like, this guy's blind. I'm imagining the scene. Here's Jesus. He's here. And this guy, he's got probably maybe two men or women holding his hands to lead him in front of Jesus. So Jesus sees this man who can't see being led in front of him. And he gets there and Jesus says, what do you want? I'm like, isn't it obvious, Jesus? And therein lies part of the problem. That sometimes it's obvious to us what we think should be done to this person, or rather, what we should think should be done to solve this problem. But what Jesus does beautifully in this scene is you notice how he personifies Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus is a real person. He's not a problem to be solved. He's not an issue to be dealt with. He's a person. And what you say to people is not, this is how I'm going to solve you. You ask, well, what do you need? What do you want? What's going on in your situation? And so often in our lives, we forget to ask that very basic question to people who are suffering. What do you want? What do you need from me? How can I help you? So the blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." And immediately he regained his sight. And notice these lines here. and followed him on the way. You see, because whatever we do for people, they invariably then have to live with. They have to live with it. They have to live in it. And so we often appear in someone's story, show them all the ways that they can be fixed and how we can fix them, and then we leave, and they have to continue living with that. And then this beautiful scene, what we see Jesus doing, and I think it's a model for us, is the first thing is, what do you want? Because what you want will now change your life. What you'll want will change the way that you go about doing things and being things. I want to ask that simply for us as a people, that we're prepared to, instead of seeing people who suffer as problems to be solved, but rather we see each other as people to whom the question, well, how can I help you? What do you need from me? What do you want? Is actually the most important thing. Because all depression is different. The writer Andrew Solomon points this out to us in his big book on depression that charts so many of the struggles of anxiety, depression, and mental illness. That we can make a huge mistake of assuming that one person's depression is the same as another person's depression. And because we know what worked for that one person, we now know what works for this other person. But we've got to confess that it's different. Our own lives are different. What's happened to you is different than what's happened to me. My journey might look similar to yours, but you realize it's very different to yours. So the question and the power of the question, what do you want, is hugely hopeful and helpful. We've got to confess that as a community, sometimes we will meet people and they will be healed. Some people will be healed miraculously by God. Some people are healed because of doctors. Some people go on a long journey towards wellness. And other people won't be healed. Some people will struggle their whole lives with the challenges that they face. And all of those people are still people, regardless of what the outcome is. But what's so difficult is that oftentimes if you are a person who's anxious or depressed or suffer with mental illness, because of the stigmas that are generated and created by that in our Western world, you often kind of feel like you're under the spotlight. You feel like everybody's looking at you. This picture, I found it to be super uncomfortable. So I shared it so that you would also be super uncomfortable. Like, why is everybody staring at you in that kind of creepy way? Like that guy in the third from the left on the front row, like, dear me, he can see your soul. And this is kind of, the more I looked at it, I thought, this is kind of what it sometimes feels like to be a person who's admitted, been brave enough to tell someone else, hey, listen, I struggle with some mental illnesses. Now you feel like you're constantly under the eyes of everyone. And that can play its way out strangely for us. Sometimes what people do is when we open a series like this, perhaps in church, people go, oh, I know someone that's depressed. I'll bring them to that series. I have a friend who I really need to send this podcast to. And it's beautiful that we care about our friends that way. But underlying this series, what I want to constantly be asking is, what about us? What about all of us? Not just those of us that suffer with mental illnesses, but those of us who are just part of this community. What does it look like for us to be part of a community where it's okay not to be okay? What does it look like to be part of that? What does it look like to not be just a crowd of people that are watching, but a crowd of people that come alongside and help? In Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, we find a really unusual St. Paul. Now, if you've read St. Paul's letters, and if you haven't, I encourage you to spend some time and look at them, you'll notice that some of them, Paul is exuberant in his encouragement and super excited about how life is working out. In other letters, he's really angry, and you detect that very quickly in those letters. But in 2 Corinthians, we see a side of Paul where it feels like he's allowing us to peer into his heart. That we see some of the brokenness, some of the pains that he has encountered as a result of unpacking the journey of following Jesus that he's going on. The planting of churches, the being a missionary throughout the Western world has caused him so much difficulty. So Paul says things in 2 Corinthians that perhaps you're not used to hearing an apostle like him say. He says that we had high levels of affliction, that we were pressed down on so many sides. He says that they were so distressed that at one point they despaired of life itself. They gave up on living. Things were that difficult. He points out that he says when he thinks of the churches every day, he's racked with anxiety when his thoughts go to them. This is a man struggling through some dark places and difficult points of his life. But then in chapter 12, he opens his autobiography a little bit further. He says this, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Now, scholars have wondered variously throughout the years, like, what is the thorn in the flesh? Because Paul doesn't unpack it. He leaves it this really mysterious thing. Like, what is it, Paul? Are you injured? Do you have some sort of injury? Most scholars don't think it was actually a thorn in his flesh. Okay, but are you injured? Do you have some sort of illness or some sort of health issue? Maybe it was Paul encountering some sort of depression or anxiety because of so much things that he says in the letter. Some people have wondered if he was married. Such a cheap joke. I'm so sorry. My personal favorite, and this comes as a father, my personal favorite is this one here. If you've ever watched SpongeBob SquarePants with your children, like, hey, Paul, what are you doing, Paul? Paul, what are you doing? Are you writing a letter, Paul? Paul, what are you doing? If you've ever watched that on repeat with a 4-year-old, you'll begin to feel a thorn in your own flesh. Paul says this. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away. He goes back to God on 3 occasions and says, and we don't know what it is, but he says, whatever it is, Paul says, God, would you take it away from me? And look at how the Lord replies. He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. This is a humbling confession from Paul. It's always humbling to share your own journey. It's always humbling to say, here's what I'm struggling with. But to say it in such a way that Paul does here, this is the apostle that planted so many of the Western world's churches, that spread the gospel throughout the Roman Empire. Here he says, I went to God, said, God, can you solve this for me? And instead of finding out that God was going to solve it for him, God simply said, I'm sufficient for you. Instead of making it go away, he found out that God was enough for him. Zach Eswin, who struggled with depression and suicide throughout his life, says this: depression calls for compassion and acceptance. See, for God to be sufficient for us requires acceptance from us. It's much easier to imagine God just dealing with everything the way we want, but actually to think about it this way, that for God's grace to be sufficient, it suggests we're going to have to learn to live in this. When it comes to talking about illness, acceptance of illness is a radical notion for many of us as Christians, because we've grown up with this idea that being a Christian is a shiny, happy life where everything looks great all the time. We used to sing a song when I was a kid in church, and one of the lines of the song about Jesus said, "In your presence, our problems disappear." And we all sang it because we were good, obedient people that listened to our worship leader. But secretly, we were kind of suspicious of the fact that it didn't really always feel like that. In fact, some people admitted that their life was doing quite well until they met Jesus. And then it seemed to kind of go downhill quite rapidly after that, when Jesus started to call them, to all sorts of difficult and different things. The problem is we've got this idea that following Jesus means everything's going to be okay. And what Paul shows us in 2 Corinthians is precisely the opposite. That everything might not be okay. That God might not rescue you. But what we do discover is that God is with us regardless. And what we discover from Paul is that it's not that grace always presents itself to us as a solution, but that grace always presents itself to us as sufficient. God will solve some things and other things he won't, but God will always be sufficient regardless of the journey you're on. So for us as a church that are saying, well, we want to work out what it means to not be okay, that we want to work out what it means for us as a community to say it's okay to not be okay, what we're journeying towards is how do we be a community of people that understand the sufficiency of God's grace, that God's grace is enough for all of us. A question I'm really asking is, what does it look like for us to be a countercultural community of care and not cure? You see, because one of the effects of not taking mental health seriously as a category is that we've only ever thought about people getting better. Because we're not always sure what to do with it, we assume that the solution is everybody's healed, everybody gets over it, everybody picks themselves back up and moves along. And what that's prevented us from taking time to think about is, what does it look like to live in this? What does it look like for a depressed person to follow Jesus? What does it look like for a person with crippling anxiety to still encounter the sufficiency of God? What does it look like to journey with those people? What does it look like that when we pray for them, we don't just pray that they get better, but we pray that they are being cared for and that we are caring for them? Essentially, the question is this: how does the church journey with people who suffer? How do we bring about care, even in situations where it doesn't look like cure is happening? It's because people, and I say this with some authority because I am a people, people are not often overly interested in your theories or your solutions or your fixies. What people actually want is your presence. They want you to be around. They want your friendship. They want your care. They want your compassion. Because most things in life are made worse if you have to do them alone. Most things in life are made cripplingly impossible if nobody wants to journey alongside you as you face those challenges. But that's so hard for us, particularly in the Western world, because we're obsessed with normal. We're obsessed with being and appearing like everything's okay all the time. Have you noticed this? We live in this world where we have whole industries. There's a whole magazine industry that's obsessed with telling you how to do normal. You know, this is what a normal body looks like. Generally speaking, it always looks underweight to me, but apparently that's what's normal. This is the kind of clothes that a normal person wears, and this is a normal person's kids. And then you look at your kids. And you cut out the picture from the magazine and send that to the grandparents for Christmas. Here's a normal person's house. Look how beautiful it is. Normal people's houses, all their pans are the same brand. The beds are made. The floors are vacuumed. Everything's beautiful. And then you look at your house. And your children ask why the clothes chair doesn't have any clothes on it today. And how they're supposed to find their underwear if they're not there. And we find ourselves constantly judged and made feel guilty because we're not achieving some standard of normal. And if you're not achieving that standard, then here's the fixies and here's the cures, and this is how you get there. And one of the most countercultural things that the church then says as a people is we're okay if you don't meet this standard of normal, because we're not even convinced that standard of normal is helpful. Andrew Solomon continues that by saying that one of the things we notice in our Western world is we've created the supermodel, which makes us feel guilty about why we don't look quite right. But we've also created the psychological supermodel that tells us that if your brain doesn't work like this, if your brain doesn't think like this, then you must need cured and you must be put back together again, because otherwise you're not quite right. And the church exists as this countercultural movement that rejects the categorizing of people into normal and not normal. That's brave enough to say, we don't say that this is normal up here and you happen to live down here, but that says that no matter where we find you, we'll journey with you, we'll walk with you, and we'll help you follow Jesus. Bill Bennett says, how we walk with the broken speaks louder than how we sit with the great. And as you walked into Westside, you see our upside-down crown. And that crown is constantly calling us to do something different, to be separate from our community, to be different from our wider society. So at Westside, what we're wrestling through as a people is to say, what does it look like to love people, but not attach the clause that says, as long as you're getting better? What does it look like to be a community that says, it's okay that you're not okay, and we will journey with you through all of your not okayness? What we're saying is you're welcome here, and there's no preconditions on that. There's not a precondition that says, well, I'm sorry, your particular illness means that we can't particularly help you. And I think that's what it is to be church. I think that's what it is to be the people of God, to be welcoming, supporting, and caring. Perhaps a way of putting it is like this: what we need is patience for patience. See, Christians are supposed to be a patient people. We're supposed to be good with patience. It's one of the virtues that's called out of us in Scripture. You may have noticed this. Our society is not very patient. If you've ever stared at a microwave and wondered why it takes 2 minutes to cook a whole turkey, then you've engaged with that lack of patience. Your grandmother had to start a fire with her bare hands just to cook a dinner. But you pushed 2 buttons and the food wasn't instantly available and you wonder what's wrong. You're on the Best Buy website finding a more powerful microwave. We don't like waiting. We can cope with pretty much anything in life as long as we don't have to wait for it. Like, I'll take anything as long as it's now. We even pray it, don't we? Dear Jesus, give me patience now. But impatience is a dangerous thing. Impatience leads to a lot of sin. In fact, a lot of sins find their roots in impatience. Think about our greeds. Think about our disobediences. Think about our sexual sins. How many of them come because we're just not willing to wait. We're just not willing to allow things to fold out the way that God has ordained them. But patience also leads us to be uncaring. Have you noticed how hard it is to journey with someone who's ill if you can't wait? Have you noticed how difficult it is to be alongside people who are struggling if you've got no patience? But the call of God to be a people who live out and manifest God's grace sufficiently is a call to do things with patience. Not just to speak great things, but to live them out. So in a world that's obsessed with cure, in a world that's obsessed with cure instantly, what the church offers is care to those who suffer. Care to those whose depressions and anxieties and fears and whatever other mental illnesses they might encounter. The church comes along beside those people and says, we can care for you in this. St. Augustine realizes that that's a big ask because patience isn't something that we just determine to have. Patience is something that must come from the Holy Spirit. So it's a gift, but it's a gift that we must ask for. It's not about just trying really hard to be patient. It's about us as a people saying, God, would you imbibe our hearts with patience? Would you be amongst us with your patience? Because we confess that we live in a society that's obsessed with hyperactivity. We're addicted to doing things and doing things now. And then the call of God, God's Spirit within us, is calling us to be a patient people, a waiting people. Stanley Harvey said, to care for one another when we cannot cure is one of the many ways that we serve one another patiently. And that's what we want to do. If you talk to depressed people, people with mental illnesses, they'll often say to you that one of the most terrifying questions that they are asked on a regular basis is this one: how are you? Because how are you often comes loaded as a question. It comes loaded with a series of expected answers. I'm asking you how you are, but what I want you to say back is, I'm getting better, or I'm doing well, or things are looking up. We don't really want the answer to how are you ever to be negative. You know this, don't you? You ask someone how they are, and they tell you that they're not doing great. It creates this really awkward social situation for us even, But if you're struggling with mental illnesses, if you're struggling with depression, and you feel that sense of pressure when you're asked how you are, unless the question comes from someone who's caring. If the question comes from someone looking for you to be cured, it's a very pressured question. But if the question comes from someone who cares, who wants to walk alongside you, the question, how are you, when it is then followed by, and how can I help, and how can I journey, and what do you want me to do, becomes a question that brings life to us. And I want to suggest that the church can be a place where we practice the patience to journey with each other. No matter how we're broken, no matter how we're in pain, no matter what our illnesses are. In Ephesians, when Paul writes to the church there in chapter 4 and verse 2, he says this to them: be completely humble and gentle, be patient, and bear with one another in love. I want to ask if we can be that type of community, if we can be the type of people that bear with one another in love, that wait patiently for one another. Because I'm convinced that one of the ways in which the world is witnessed to by the church, one of the ways in which the church shows that Jesus is actually Lord, is by our refusal to live in a world where cure is the only thing we'll accept. But instead, the church confesses the lordship of Jesus by being patient, by journeying with people at the pace that they can cope with, by being prepared to live with people regardless of the story of pain that they live. So to follow Jesus, both as individuals as a church, is to recognize depression, anxiety, fear, mental illness, to accept it. Accept that sometimes it will get better and sometimes it will get worse. But regardless, to patiently journey with those who suffer. I believe that is what it is for us to be the church. So let me give you a benediction today in the form of a challenge. How does fear, anxiety, and depression affect you? Not just your friend or family member that has it, but how does it affect you? What is it calling out of you? What is Jesus asking us to do about this? Can we commit to being a community that patiently works out being the church in a world of impatience? Can we journey in God's sufficient grace with care rather than just an aim to cure? In Isaiah 42 in verse 3, there's a beautiful description of God which poetically says this: "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out." Let me pray for you. May you, who in this room feel like a bruised reed or the smoldering wick, or may you who have family members and friends that you know are bruised and smoldering, may you find the sufficiency of God's grace, the sufficiency to patiently work through your difficulties, to patiently endure with God's strength, the patience to trust that God can be sufficient for your family member or friend, or colleague, or church member. But may you find a patience that is gentle, a patience that is caring, and a patience that is supportive, all of which creates space to reveal the incredible sufficiency of God's grace in our life. And may his grace and peace be on you. Amen. Thank you.